It wasn't a formal announcement, no palace statement, no carefully crafted speech. Just a message short, abrupt, and impossible to ignore. I am abdicating. Sent directly to Prince Harry. No context, no warning, no explanation. Within seconds, a chain reaction began: panic behind palace walls, silence among senior royals, and one decision that would shake everything: Harry boarding a flight back to the UK. Immediately. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The words didn't just sit on Harry's phone, they echoed. They lingered in a way that felt heavier than their simplicity should have allowed, as if every letter carried something unsaid, something buried beneath years of distance, tension, and carefully managed silence. This wasn't how the monarchy communicated. It wasn't how decisions of this magnitude were ever revealed. There were systems, protocols, layers of consultation that existed precisely to prevent something like this from happening. And yet, here it was, unfiltered, direct, and deeply personal. For a moment, Harry didn't move. He read it again, and again, as if repetition might unlock meaning that wasn't immediately visible. But the message refused to explain itself, and that silence began to feel intentional. Far from the controlled atmosphere of palace walls, Harry was alone when it arrived. No advisors. No immediate voices to interpret or soften the impact. Just him and a sentence that threatened to rewrite everything he thought he understood. The distance that had once felt like protection suddenly turned into isolation, because now there was no buffer, no delay, only a decision waiting to be made. And beneath the surface of that decision was something far more complicated than duty. It was history. It was unresolved emotion. It was a relationship that had never quite found stability, now demanding immediate attention under the most unexpected circumstances. But what made the message even more unsettling wasn't just what it said, it was who it didn't include. There was no mention of William. No indication that the future king had been informed, consulted, or even considered. That absence didn't feel accidental. It felt deliberate. And in a family where hierarchy and order define everything, breaking that pattern signaled something deeper, something potentially divisive. Almost as if Charles had bypassed the expected path on purpose, reaching for Harry instead, not as a spare, not as an outsider, but as someone whose presence suddenly mattered in a way no one had anticipated. Inside the palace, confusion spread faster than clarity. Aides weren't reacting to an official directive, they were reacting to whispers, fragments, incomplete information that refused to settle into anything concrete. Phones buzzed. Conversations started and stopped mid-sentence. There was no confirmation, no unified response, only a growing awareness that something had shifted beyond control. Some questioned whether the message had been sent in a moment of emotion, a private thought made public by accident. Others feared something far more serious, that this was intentional, that it was the beginning of a decision already set in motion behind closed doors. And then there were the whispers. Quiet, cautious, but impossible to ignore. This wasn't just abdication. It couldn't be. Not like this. There was something else beneath it, something personal, something destabilizing, something that had been building long before those 4 words appeared on Harry's screen. The tone alone carried weight that protocol could never explain. It didn't sound like a king addressing succession. It sounded like a man reaching a limit. That was the moment Harry understood this wasn't a situation that could be observed from a distance. There would be no waiting, no careful consideration of optics, no slow response shaped by advisors and timing. Whatever this was, it demanded immediacy. And so, without announcement, without coordination, without even the courtesy of explanation to the outside world, the decision was made. A flight was arranged. A return set into motion not by obligation, but by something far more urgent, something that felt dangerously close to unraveling. Because as the reality settled in, one truth became impossible to ignore. This message wasn't just unexpected. It was disruptive. It challenged the structure, the order, the unspoken rules that had always kept the monarchy steady even in moments of crisis. And if those rules were now being broken, then whatever had caused it was not something small, not something temporary, but something capable of shifting everything at once. But as Harry's plane cut through the sky toward Britain, the question that began haunting everyone wasn't just why Charles would abdicate, it was what had pushed him to do it so suddenly. Inside the palace, silence wasn't calm, it was suffocating. Doors closed. Conversations cut short. Staff whispered but never finished sentences. Something had shifted, and everyone could feel it. Charles had not issued any formal notice. No advisors had been consulted. No preparations had been made. It was as if the monarchy itself had been blindsided by its own king. And no one knew what would happen next. The realization didn't arrive all at once, it crept in. Quietly at first, then all at once overwhelming. Senior aides weren't called into a meeting or handed an official directive. Instead, they discovered fragments. A message mentioned in passing. A rumor repeated with hesitation. A confirmation that never fully formed, but felt impossible to dismiss. The structure they relied on, order, clarity, sequence, had been replaced with uncertainty. And that uncertainty spread quickly, moving through corridors and offices like something uncontainable. Something that refused to settle into logic. For those closest to the center, the confusion was more than procedural, it was deeply unsettling. There were no instructions to follow, no narrative to present, no carefully prepared response to manage what was unfolding. The monarchy, known for its control, suddenly felt exposed, vulnerable, as if a single unexpected decision had stripped away layers of protection that had always been assumed to be unbreakable. And the more they searched for clarity, the more they realized it wasn't coming. Then there was William. Or rather, the absence of him. In moments like this, his presence was expected, almost instinctive. A stabilizing force. A visible figure stepping forward to anchor the uncertainty. But this time, there was distance. Not just physical, but something quieter, more difficult to define. He wasn't leading the response. He wasn't shaping the narrative. He wasn't even visible in the way the situation seemed to demand. And that silence carried its own weight, raising questions no one dared to voice out loud. Because in that absence, speculation began to form. Had he been informed? Had he chosen to step back? Or was this distance itself a sign of something deeper, something fractured beneath the surface, that had been carefully hidden until now? The questions lingered, unanswered, feeding the growing tension rather than easing it. And the more time passed without clarity, the more significant that silence became. Camilla, on the other hand, remained composed, at least outwardly. Her response, measured and controlled, gave nothing away. But those paying close attention could sense it. The shift beneath the surface. The effort it took to maintain that calm. Because this wasn't a situation that could be managed through appearance alone. Something had disrupted the balance. And even the most practiced composure couldn't fully conceal the impact of that disruption. Meanwhile, instructions began to circulate, but they didn't bring clarity, they reinforced the uncertainty. Say nothing. Simple, direct, and deeply revealing. Because silence, in this context, wasn't strategy, it was containment. An attempt to hold back something that felt dangerously close to spilling beyond control. But the more the staff were told to remain quiet, the louder the speculation became. Conversations didn't stop, they just moved, becoming more cautious, more fragmented, more charged with the awareness that something significant was being withheld. What made it even more unsettling was the complete lack of coordination. No unified message. No synchronized response. The system that had always operated with precision now felt disjointed, almost reactive. And in that breakdown, a realization began to take shape. This wasn't planned. This wasn't controlled. This was something else entirely, something that had broken through the usual barriers without warning. And then, beneath the confusion, another layer began to surface. Rumors. Quiet at first, almost reluctant to be spoken. That this moment hadn't come out of nowhere, that in recent weeks there had been pressure building behind closed doors. Conversations that grew more intense, decisions that became harder to contain. A weight that had been increasing, slowly but steadily, until it reached a point where it could no longer be managed within the boundaries of tradition. If that was true, then this wasn't just a sudden decision. It was the result of something deeper, something that had been unfolding quietly, hidden beneath the surface until it could no longer remain there. And that possibility made everything feel more fragile, more uncertain. Because it suggested that what they were witnessing wasn't the beginning of a crisis, it was the moment it finally broke through. And as the palace struggled to contain the silence, Harry was getting closer, and with him, questions no one inside was ready to answer. This wasn't just a return. It was a reckoning. For years, Harry had kept his distance physically, emotionally, strategically. But now, that distance was collapsing. The message from Charles wasn't just about abdication, it felt personal, urgent, almost like a call for help. And as Harry stepped onto British soil again, one thing became clear. This wasn't going to be a quiet reunion. The moment his decision was made, the weight of it settled in not as clarity, but as conflict. Because returning wasn't simple. It wasn't just about showing up. It meant stepping back into a world he had deliberately walked away from. A system that had both defined him and pushed him to the edge. Every mile that brought him closer also brought back memories he had tried to silence, fractures that never fully healed, conversations that ended without resolution, and a sense of distance that had slowly become his protection. Now that protection was gone, replaced by something far more urgent. There was no ceremony in this return. No announcement, no coordinated arrival, no public acknowledgement that he was even coming back. It happened quietly, almost as if it needed to. As if the moment itself was too fragile, too unpredictable to withstand attention. And within that silence was a message of its own. This wasn't about image. It wasn't about appearances. This was about something real, something immediate, something that couldn't wait. The absence of Meghan only deepened that understanding. It wasn't a separation, it was a signal. A choice that suggested focus, seriousness, and perhaps even an awareness that what awaited him required his full attention, undivided and unfiltered. Because this wasn't a visit shaped by diplomacy or routine. It was a response to something that had already begun to unravel. And Harry knew that whatever he was walking into, it would not allow for distance. Not this time. Security tightened in ways that felt different, almost disproportionate. Movements were controlled, information restricted, details kept deliberately vague. Even within a system built on discretion, this level of secrecy stood out. It hinted at something deeper than protocol, something that required containment, something that couldn't risk exposure. Not yet. And for Harry, that only sharpened the tension. Because the less that was said, the more it suggested that the truth was far more complicated than anyone was willing to admit. There were already whispers forming around one question that refused to fade. Why Harry? Why him, and not William? In a structure so deeply rooted in hierarchy, that choice carried weight. It disrupted expectation. It challenged the natural order. And it implied that this moment, whatever it truly was, had shifted beyond tradition. That Charles hadn't just reached out to a son, he had reached out to a specific one, for reasons that were still hidden but impossible to ignore. And as Harry moved closer to the center of it all, the emotional weight began to change. It was no longer just about confusion or urgency, it became something heavier, something more personal. Because beneath the crisis, beneath the message and the silence, there was a relationship that had never found stability, now demanding confrontation. Not later, not gradually, but now, in the middle of something that felt dangerously close to breaking. There was also a growing sense, subtle but persistent, that Harry wasn't stepping into this blindly. That somewhere, beneath the surface, he understood more than he had allowed himself to reveal. Small details, fragments of conversations, hints that may have once seemed insignificant, but now felt connected in a way that couldn't be ignored. And if that was true, then his return wasn't just reactive, it was informed, intentional, almost inevitable. Because this wasn't just about responding to a message. It was about stepping into something that had already been set in motion long before that message was sent. Something that had been building quietly, gathering weight, waiting for the moment it could no longer be contained. And now, Harry was no longer outside of it. He was inside it. But the deeper Harry moved into the heart of the monarchy again, the more it became clear this wasn't just about abdication. It was about something far more destabilizing. Kings don't abdicate without warning. Not like this. Not in silence. So what could drive Charles, a man who waited a lifetime for the crown, to suddenly walk away from it? Behind the royal image, behind the carefully managed appearances, something had been building. Quietly. Intensely. And now it had reached a breaking point that could no longer be hidden or controlled. The pressure hadn't appeared overnight. It had been forming in layers, subtle at first, almost invisible beneath the routine of duty and expectation. Conversations that once ended in agreement began to stall. Decisions that once felt straightforward became complicated, weighed down by tension that no one openly acknowledged. Inside the monarchy, conflict rarely explodes, it accumulates. And in Charles's world, that accumulation had been happening for far longer than anyone outside could have realized. There were fractures, quiet but persistent, threading through the structure of the family itself. Differences in vision, differences in control, differences in what the future should look like, and who should shape it. These weren't public disagreements. They lived behind closed doors, in conversations that never reached the outside world. But the intensity of those exchanges began to shift something. What was once manageable became strained. What was once contained began to press outward, testing the limits of how much could be held together without breaking. And within that growing strain, something more personal began to surface. Because this wasn't just about the institution, it was about the man at its center. A man who had waited decades to step into a role defined by power, only to find that power came with a weight that could not be shared, could not be reduced, and could not be escaped. Every decision carried consequence. Every silence carried implication. And over time, that weight began to transform into something heavier, something closer to exhaustion than authority. There were signs, subtle but telling, a gradual distancing from those who had once been constant. Fewer consultations, shorter discussions, moments where guidance was expected but never requested. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't obvious, but it was enough to create a shift, enough for those paying close attention to sense that something was changing, not externally, but internally, as if Charles had begun to withdraw, not from duty, but from the system surrounding it. And then there was the possibility no one wanted to confront directly, that this decision, this sudden, disruptive message, wasn't driven by conflict alone. That something else had surfaced. Something deeply personal, a realization perhaps, or a truth that had remained hidden until it could no longer stay that way. Because the tone of that message didn't feel strategic. It didn't feel calculated. It felt final in a way that suggested clarity, but also urgency, as if the decision had already been made long before it was ever put into words. That's what made it unsettling. Because abdication, in its traditional sense, is an act of transition, a controlled shift of power, planned and executed with precision. But this didn't feel like transition. It felt like departure, like stepping away not just from responsibility, but from something far more personal. Something that had reached a point where staying was no longer possible. And that's where the narrative began to change. Because if this wasn't about the crown alone, then it wasn't just about succession. It was about escape. The kind that doesn't come from impulse, but from accumulation. From reaching a place where the weight becomes too much, the silence too heavy, the pressure too constant. And in that context, the message takes on a different meaning, not as a declaration of change, but as a signal of something already broken. Which raises a question far more unsettling than the act itself. Because if Charles wasn't simply stepping down, if he was stepping away, then whatever had driven him to that point wasn't something that could be easily resolved. It wasn't temporary. It wasn't surface level. It was something deeper, something embedded, something that had been building long before anyone realized it was there. And if Charles was trying to escape something, the question became unavoidable: who or what was he trying to escape from? In every royal crisis, one name is expected to lead the response: William. But this time, something was different. He wasn't front and center. He wasn't coordinating. He wasn't even visible. And as Harry arrived, it became impossible to ignore the future king was nowhere to be found. Was it strategy, or was it distance that spoke louder than any statement? The absence didn't feel accidental. In a system built on presence, where every movement is deliberate and every silence carries meaning, William's distance became its own kind of signal. Not loud, not direct, but impossible to overlook. Because in moments like this, moments that threaten to destabilize everything, the expectation is clear. The heir steps forward. He anchors the uncertainty. He becomes the visible line between crisis and control. And yet that line was missing. At first, there were attempts to explain it away. Timing. Scheduling. Private consultations happening behind the scenes. But those explanations didn't hold for long. Not when the situation itself was escalating. Not when the urgency of Charles's message had already disrupted the usual order. Because if there was ever a moment that demanded visibility, this was it. And the longer William remained out of reach, the more that absence began to feel intentional. That's when the speculation began to shift. It wasn't just about where he was, it was about why he wasn't there. Questions that had once been unspoken started to take shape beneath the surface. Had there been disagreements? Not the quiet, manageable kind, but something deeper. Something that had grown beyond discussion and into distance. Because the idea that Charles would bypass William, would send a message of this magnitude to Harry instead, didn't just challenge protocol. It challenged hierarchy. And hierarchy, within the monarchy, is everything. If Charles had chosen Harry in that moment, it suggested a break. A deviation from the expected path. And that deviation carried weight, because it implied that the relationship between present and future king was not as aligned as it needed to be. That something had shifted between them, quietly but significantly, long before this moment forced it into the open. For Harry, stepping into this space only complicated it further. Because his presence didn't just fill a gap, it reshaped it. The very act of his return created a new dynamic, one that neither followed tradition nor respected the usual boundaries. And in doing so, it raised a question that no one inside the palace could comfortably answer. Was Harry simply responding, or was he being positioned? That uncertainty added another layer to the tension already building. Because if Harry's involvement had been requested directly, if Charles had deliberately reached out to him instead of William, then this wasn't just about family, it was about trust. About alignment. About who, in this moment of instability, was seen as necessary. And that is where the emotional fracture began to deepen. The distance between the brothers, once defined by separation and silence, now found itself pulled back into relevance under the worst possible circumstances. This wasn't a controlled environment. There were no prepared statements, no mediated interactions, no carefully timed appearances. Just a situation unfolding too quickly to manage, forcing old tensions into a space where they could no longer be ignored. Insiders, careful with their words but unable to fully hide the truth, began to hint at it, not directly, never directly, but enough to suggest that beneath the surface something had been building, a strain that had never been fully resolved, a difference in direction that had never been reconciled. And now, under pressure, that strain was beginning to show. Because in a moment where leadership should have been clear, it wasn't. In a situation where roles should have been defined, they felt uncertain. And in that uncertainty, the balance of control began to shift in ways no one had anticipated. And that leads to the most unsettling question of all. Because if the future king was absent, and the returning prince was suddenly central, then who was truly in control of what was happening? Who was shaping the outcome of a decision that could redefine everything? And as tension between past, present, and future heirs intensified, Harry found himself stepping into a role he never expected to reclaim. No cameras. No statements. No witnesses, just a closed door and a conversation that could redefine everything. When Harry finally came face to face with Charles, the world was left outside. But inside that room, truths long buried began to surface. And whatever was said in that moment, it changed the course of what would happen next. The meeting itself wasn't announced, not even acknowledged in the subtle ways the palace often signals significance. It simply happened, quietly and deliberately, as if even the existence of it needed to be protected. No schedules were updated. No briefings were given. The absence of confirmation became confirmation in its own way. Because when something is this carefully hidden, it suggests not just importance but risk. The kind of risk that can't be managed through messaging or softened through interpretation. For Harry, stepping into that room meant stepping into something far more complex than a conversation. It was history waiting to be confronted. Not just recent tension, but years of distance layered with moments that had never been resolved. Words that had never been spoken when they should have been. And now, all of it pressing forward at once, demanding to be acknowledged in a space where there was no audience, no interruption, no escape. At first, the silence between them would have carried its own weight, not empty, but charged. Because how do you begin a conversation like this? With duty? With emotion? With accusation? Or with something simpler, something more honest? The answer, it seemed, didn't come easily. Because this wasn't a controlled exchange, it was something far more unpredictable, shaped not by protocol but by everything that had been left unsaid. And then, slowly, the truth began to surface, not all at once, not in a single revelation, but in fragments. Enough to shift the tone, enough to change the direction of what Harry thought he was walking into. Because the message "I am abdicating" wasn't the full story. It couldn't have been. And as Charles began to speak, that became impossible to ignore. There was something different in him. Not in authority, not in position, but in presence. A vulnerability that didn't align with the image he had always maintained. It wasn't weakness, it was exposure. As if the weight he had been carrying had finally reached a point where it could no longer be contained behind expectation and control. And in that exposure, something else emerged. Not just explanation, but admission. For Harry, that shift changed everything. What had begun as confusion began to sharpen into urgency. Because whatever Charles was revealing wasn't just personal, it had implications. Not only for him, but for everything surrounding him. The monarchy, the structure, the future that had always been assumed to follow a certain path. That path no longer felt certain. It felt fragile, unstable in a way that couldn't be easily corrected. And that's where the emotional tension deepened. Because this wasn't just a father speaking to a son, it was a king confronting the consequences of something far larger than himself. And Harry, whether he wanted to be or not, was now part of that confrontation. Not as an observer, not as someone on the outside, but as someone directly pulled into the center of it. There were moments in that conversation where the weight of it all became undeniable, where the words carried more than meaning, they carried consequence. And in those moments, it became clear that abdication was not the conclusion. It was only the surface. Beneath it was something else. Something that hadn't been revealed publicly. Something that extended beyond a single decision into something much more complex, much more dangerous. Because if abdication was the message, then what lay beneath it was the reason. And that reason, whatever it truly was, had the power to reshape everything. By the time the conversation began to settle, if it ever truly did, Harry was no longer standing in the same position he had been when he entered. The uncertainty hadn't disappeared, it had grown. But it had also changed. It was no longer about understanding why the message had been sent. It was about understanding what came next. Because what emerged from that room wasn't clarity, it was something far more dangerous. Uncertainty at the highest level of the monarchy. For the public, nothing had changed. No announcement. No confirmation. But behind the scenes, everything was unraveling. A king ready to step down. An heir absent. A returning prince caught in the middle. The structure that had held the monarchy steady for generations was beginning to crack, and the world hadn't even been told yet. Inside that fragile silence, instability wasn't loud, it was spreading quietly, steadily, in ways that felt far more dangerous than open chaos. Because when a system built on control begins to lose its balance, it doesn't collapse immediately. It hesitates, it shifts, it strains under pressure until every small fracture starts to matter. And in this moment, those fractures were everywhere. Leadership, once defined by certainty, now felt uncertain. Authority, once unquestioned, now felt divided. Advisors who had always operated with a shared sense of direction were no longer aligned. Conversations that should have led to decisions instead led to hesitation. Some argued for immediate action, contain the situation, control the narrative, prepare the public before speculation takes over. Others pushed for silence, hold everything back. Keep the structure intact until clarity emerges. Avoid triggering something that cannot be reversed. And between those positions, tension grew. Not open conflict, but a quiet division that made every step forward feel uncertain. Because the risk wasn't just internal, it was external. The longer the silence held, the more fragile it became. Information, even when carefully guarded, has a way of slipping through. A single detail, a single confirmation could shift everything from contained crisis to public revelation. And once that line was crossed, there would be no controlling it. The monarchy, so carefully preserved through image and timing, would be exposed to a narrative it didn't shape. And that possibility lingered over every decision, making even the smallest move feel high stakes. At the center of it all was a question that no one could fully answer. What happens next? Because abdication isn't just a personal decision, it's a structural one. It demands timing, coordination, legitimacy. And none of those elements were in place. There had been no preparation, no transition, no gradual shift of responsibility. Just a message. A moment. A disruption that had arrived without warning and now refused to settle into anything predictable. That lack of clarity began to weigh heavily on those closest to the situation. Not just as professionals, but as individuals caught inside something they couldn't control. The emotional toll wasn't visible, but it was there in the hesitation, in the careful words, in the awareness that every decision carried consequences that extended far beyond the present moment. Because this wasn't just about managing a crisis. It was about preserving something that had defined itself through stability, now facing a moment where that stability felt uncertain. And within that uncertainty, a realization began to take hold. This wasn't a temporary disruption. It wasn't something that could be smoothed over or quietly resolved behind closed doors. Whatever had been set in motion had already changed the dynamic, already shifted the balance, already introduced a level of unpredictability that couldn't simply be undone. Because if a king could step away without warning, if an heir could remain absent during a defining moment, if a returning prince could suddenly become central to a decision he was never meant to shape, then the structure itself was no longer as fixed as it once seemed. And that realization carried weight. Not just internally, but historically. Because moments like this don't just pass, they redefine. They leave behind consequences that reshape how everything moves forward. And as that truth settled in, the tension didn't ease, it intensified. Because the future, once clear, now felt uncertain in a way no one could fully predict. And just when it seemed the situation couldn't become more volatile, a final twist began to take shape, one that no one saw coming. It all came down to one decision. Not from advisors, not from tradition, but from within the fractured core of the royal family itself. Would Charles follow through? Would William step forward? Or would Harry unexpectedly, unwillingly be pulled into something far bigger than a return home? The answer wasn't simple, and it wasn't safe. The message was sent. The flight was taken. The meeting happened. But the truth, still unfolding. Because sometimes, the most powerful moments aren't the ones we see, they're the ones hidden just beneath the surface. And as the world waits for answers, one thing is certain. Whatever happened behind those palace walls, it isn't over. Inside the palace, the atmosphere had shifted from confusion to something far more intense: pressure. Not loud, not chaotic, but heavy. Every conversation now carried weight. Every silence felt deliberate. The debates that had once been cautious were now reaching their limits, pushing toward a point where hesitation was no longer an option. Decisions had to be made. Not eventually, not carefully, but now. And yet, no one seemed ready to take that final step. At the center of it all, Charles stood at the edge of his own declaration. The words had already been sent, the intent already revealed, but the reality of what abdication truly meant was beginning to settle in. This wasn't just about stepping away, it was about what that departure would leave behind. A shift in power, a disruption in continuity, a ripple that would move through every layer of the monarchy. And for the first time, there was a sense that even he was reconsidering the full weight of what he had set into motion. Harry, meanwhile, had become something no one had anticipated. Not just a participant, but a presence that influenced the direction of everything unfolding. His return had altered the balance. introduced a perspective that couldn't be ignored. And whether intentional or not, his position now carried weight. Not authority, not control, but influence. The kind that emerges in moments of instability, when the usual structure no longer holds. And then there was William, still unseen, but impossible to ignore. His absence had transformed into something more than distance. It had become presence of a different kind. A looming question. A silent force shaping the tension without ever stepping forward to define it. Because in a moment where he should have been central, his distance raised doubts that no one could easily dismiss. Beyond the palace walls, the pressure continued to build. The public didn't know, but they would. And when they did, the reaction wouldn't be controlled or predictable. It would be immediate, emotional, unforgiving. That awareness lingered over every internal decision, reminding those inside that time was not on their side. That silence, while protective now, would eventually become exposure. And still, no final announcement came. Which is what made everything feel even more fragile. Because a decision was forming slowly, quietly, but undeniably. It was there in the pauses, in the hesitation, in the way every conversation seemed to circle back to the same unresolved point. Something was about to happen. Something that would define not just this moment, but everything that followed. Because in the end, the biggest shock wasn't the message. It was what came after it. The monarchy now stood at a crossroads it had never faced in quite this way. Not because of the act itself, but because of how it had unfolded. Quietly, unexpectedly, without the structure that had always protected it. And in that absence of control, something deeper had been revealed, a fragility that had always existed, but had never been seen this clearly. Tension remained, stretching between every key figure, unresolved and persistent. Nothing had been settled. Nothing had been confirmed. And yet, everything had changed. The silence was no longer just absence, it was weight. A space filled with unanswered questions, with possibilities that felt both inevitable and uncertain. Speculation was already beginning to rise beyond those walls, even without confirmation. Because moments like this don't stay hidden for long. They surface, they expand, and when they do, they bring with them a demand for answers that cannot be ignored. Which leads to the most unsettling realization of all. This wasn't the end of something. It wasn't even the resolution. It was the beginning. The first visible crack in something much larger. Something that had been building long before anyone realized it would reach this point. And as silence stretches on, the question remains, what truth is still being kept from the world? Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.